for a game designer, I think it is incredibly important that we keep the medium inclusive, that we start decolonizing what is deeply toxic within the medium already, and we allow room within the medium for new practitioners to flourish and feel safe within, which is very hard to do inside games right now. So women working within the games industries, transgender stories being told within the medium of games, are finding it very hard to break through the barrier of, again, sort of cis white male narratives that have colonized the medium for a very, very long time.
This is Audiogyan, and I am your host, Kedar Nimkar. Welcome to a deep dive into the minds of luminaries from the Indian creative world. The main episode, I'll start off by asking more kind of a fundamental question, like who according to you is a game designer, right? What does a game designer do, and also what does it mean to become a game designer? You call it interactive fiction, which is kind of new for me. So you can start off with like, what's your observation so far? And since you said that you're still discovering, what are your observations around it, and what does any skills that are particularly required, or we can start there.
So to try and articulate what a game designer does, or even who a game designer is a little hard because the industry has a very broad understanding of the notion of game design. But it does boil down to trying to articulate the task of defining rules for what eventually define the game itself, right? The task of trying to curate for yourself from reality what is going to be a part of the simulation that players are going to be participating in, and therefore spending their time sort of engaging with. And then that typically tends to be the role of a game designer. Now that sounds very abstract and very broad, because this changes dramatically depending on the medium of game design, depending on the scale of game design. So for example, a board game designer who will usually be working with cardboard bits and iconographic simulation of real world systems will have a very different role compared to a game designer in a AAA video game studio, who will have animators and graphic designers and narrative designers working under them, and will be collaborating with historians and weapons specialists and cinematographers and so many others, and translators and so on and so forth. Right? So sometimes the role becomes being a shepherd of a very large team to try and curate a coherent sort of narrative experience out of it. And sometimes for small indie game studios, it's an artist programmer who's also defining what the game experience is going to be for a player.
Got it. And then if you can pick up like a niche in it, which you particularly deal with, what could be like the core skills that are generally required?
So I typically work on the very fringes of conventional game design. I work with very experimental games, very weird games that often sit at the intersections of games and something else, typically games and literature. So for me, the act of working with words, working with language, and adding a degree of interaction to language and being able to modulate it is very, very crucial to being able to build games. And that, I think, carries into a variety of other game practices as well, because most games, especially narrative games in some form or the other, do deal with the idea of storytelling of some kind, or do deal with the idea of insularity. So I mentioned a little while ago the idea that game designers are bounding the world away from reality by creating a sort of circumference of rules within which you play. And that idea of curating for yourself, what is going to be game and what is going to be outside the game is crucial to being able to design a game.
Okay. Could you give an example? What does it mean to be in the game and outside the game? Because what I gather is when you're outside the game, is it how is it sort of psychologically influencing your worldview? Is that that meta, or like there is something more?
So it's actually very simple. So for example, if you go around, kicking objects in the real world, people are going to get quite mad at you, but you're quite literally expected to do that when you're playing football. right? So something about crossing into the threshold of a green grass-laden field with 11 other players, 10 other players, automatically puts you in a social category where you are allowed to kick round objects and occasionally kick other people as well, I guess.
Hmm.
Now that is a very odd social contract to enter into, right? So it's a very bizarre thing. So somebody who's not familiar with football, an anthropologist looking at it would say, why are these people doing that? uh, but we communally agree that that is okay for us to do, and to cheer it on as a social activity. So that social contract, some people call it the magic circle of games, where the moment you enter into the designated space of a game, which could be an intellectual space, which could be a linguistic space, or a physical space like a playground, you start conditioning all your actions to fit the rules of a particular game, and the rules are only really known to those who are privy to the language of the game. Become this very very peculiar kind of communal act that humans tend to engage in. And that
Hmm.
is very typical to games. You don't really find humans doing this for most other cultural media.
Hmm. 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 Quite interesting. But yeah, I'm going to like further like follow up on that. Is that but then like you operate in the fringes, but like what happens in the traditional media? Like any hard skill or any particular attribute or a trait which like especially for a designer, especially for a game designer.
So weirdly enough, because the project of building games commercially is relatively new, right? It is about a generation old. So you have some of the earliest video games start appearing in the late 1970s. They start to get really articulate by late 1980s. So if you think about somebody who's born then, or born a little bit prior to it, and sort of grows up playing those games, you have most of these games designed by people who have no training in building games.
Hmm.
And for the longest time, the idea of game design has been open to people from other disciplines to venture into. So animators becoming game designers, programmers becoming game designers, which is very common, authors becoming game designers. Increasingly, we are starting to formalize the discipline. So there is some theoretical understanding, some practical understanding of what it takes to design a game, what it takes to design rule sets, systems, a kind of cybernetic approach almost to try and understand how a series of processes are going to interleave, and then how our player is going to interact with them. So designing those does seem to require a set of very specific skills. Weirdly enough, we don't quite know what they are. So more
Hmm.
often than not, even in game design courses, we teach them quite literally by doing, right? So by playing pen and paper prototypes, by building them, and by endlessly building games, and using the fact that games tend to be legacy systems, to learn by playing, and to learn quite literally by building, and sort of practicing the act of building games. But within the broad scholarship of sort of game studies, and game culture, there are attempts at trying to define what does a game designer do, right?
Hmm.
Especially in certain pockets and in certain kinds of games, especially around video games, where the role tends to be very contested, and very very sought after.
Got it. I want to like just have a little off-script question because I interviewed Uday Atvankar a long time ago, professor at IDC, and he said that I generally engage students in telling that like build a game, and you got a constraint of making it in 100 rupees, right? And they make it, and then like suddenly he changes the brief saying now you have to make it in 50 rupees, the same game, eventually landing up in no money required for the same game to be built. So, what is emerging while this process is happening? Like, if you can, you know what I mean, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's something which is emerging out.
Definitely. I mean, I'm sure the professor in question has a very specific set of sort of arguments that he's also trying to make. But if I were to extrapolate or hypothesize, the idea of taking the metric of money and the material that you can access with money and tying it into games suddenly puts an artificial constraint around what you can build with what, right? It puts the constraint of scale. This is what I can buy, and these are the number of players I can engage, based on what I imagine I can do with 100 rupees. And then
Oh,
suddenly,
no, sorry to interrupt. Maybe like what I wanted to ask you was that uh, imagine the money is like one parameter of putting in constraints, but something is emerging out. Is it the narrative? Is it the dynamics of which these different role plays will
huh,
happen? Like that's what
good.
I'm trying to emerge.
Got it, got it. I think what is actually emerging is the transition from play to formal games. Uh, the act of playing becoming a social act. So if you think about the act of playing, right, playing with a ball, for example, you are only dealing with the materiality of the object that you're playing with, the springiness of a ball, the elasticity of it. The moment you impose a rule condition to it, if I bounce the ball thrice, I get 1 point, and if I miss a bounce, I lose a point, or something like that. It suddenly becomes a game. But where did the rules come from? They are arbitrary to the material nature of the ball itself. And they've been imposed through language, they've been imposed through social dictum, through surveillance, through money, through reward systems, points, or something like that. So, hereby imposing an arbitrary constraint on the idea of making a game itself, the professor seems to be forcing the students to transition from mere play to a social contract, which is more explicitly a game, a sport, or something that is recognizably systemic, and then tightening that constraint further as you sort of reduce the money, to see how insignificant materials might be to the rules that are getting constructed within it. How easy it might be, or how hard it might be for that matter, to transition rules from one state to another, and so on.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, I'm sure. I think the undercurrent of this exercise may not be evident while they're actually in college or never exposed to like the larger social dynamics, but it's a good start to at least train how to think about it.
Definitely. And
Yeah.
often the idea of building games tends to be very separate from the idea of studying it.
Hmm.
So sometimes you might be, very good at building games, but you need not ever ponder, why they work the way they do. You might intuitively find your way towards game systems that just make sense and are incredibly fun to engage with.
Mm-hmm. Correct. So, can you give like a quick sort of? I know it's very tough to give a quick snapshot, but yeah, like a snapshot of like how did like generally games came to be, right? Like how did it evolve? And I was just thinking that how did like the based on your first answer was like how did like the rock paper scissors kind of thing evolve to like what we have today, from Pokemon to werewolf? Like how has that? Is there a way to even study that on which parameters can be we can see this timeline?
So that's a wonderful question. Is there even a way to study it? That has been a
Hmm.
sort of burning question for ludologists for a long time. Games are incredibly hard to study, especially if you are trying to study them in a taxonomic, hierarchy of some kind, or a teleological hierarchy of some kind. Where do they come from? Where are they headed? That kind of linearity. If you're looking for, it's very hard to ascertain. We know that play is inherent, the idea of play is inherent to humans, and that games do seem to emerge out of societies. But it's very hard to pinpoint what game emerges when. What is the earliest game that was ever played, and what society played it? What is the most popular game that has survived across multiple societal or civilizational transitions and has remained relatively unchanged? I mean, we have examples of them, of course, and we can trace rules back for certain games, and inscriptions on stones and markings and Olympic stadiums, and so on. And even cultures surrounding games have percolated into language, like war games and so on. But it's again very hard to pinpoint exactly what game gives us the plethora of games that we are now surrounded by. What is the
Hmm.
ancestor to a contemporary video game in direct terms? And I suspect there isn't one. The idea that games are automatically teleological, or they follow some linear continuum, might not be true, and that they seem to emerge in sporadic bursts. So it becomes much easier to study the nature of games. Why do we play in social groups in this particular manner? How important is it for a stable society to continue playing privately, to continue playing publicly, to play with what exactly? Do you play with societal norms? Do you play with abstract, material artifacts? Do you play with waste from society? Do you play with language itself? And depending on what societies play with, how stable have they been in relationship to the games that they have produced? Are games good mirrors of the societies that they emerge from, or are they abstracted from the societies they emerge from? So some of these questions sort of start to, I know I'm not doing a very good job of narrating a history of where games come from, but you start to ask
Correct.
these questions the moment you start wondering, where do they come from anyways? These plethora of games that surround us. But it is remarkably instructive to look at the individual histories of specific traditions of games. I'll give just a short example here. Take, for example, interactive fiction, the sort of domain within which I practice, which is often text adventures, games that are played only using text for the most part, and they are electronic or analog. Increasingly electronic in nature, and most narrative video games are undergirded by forms of interactive fiction. So interactive fictions tend to be one of the first electronic games ever created. So some of the earliest electronic games ever created were interactive fictions, and in fact one of the very first games ever created, called Advent, was a wandering around the Kentucky Mammoth Cave network. So there was a computer scientist who was accompanying his wife, who was spelunking in those caves, and to keep track of their position within a very, very large cave network, he would draw computer-aided maps that he would then revisit in text form just to wander around them. Which eventually became a game, as soon as he put it up on ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet. Now, the maps for those caves were first articulated, or at least a very large number of those caves were articulated by a geologist called Stephen Bishop about 100 years before this particular author, Will Crowther, sort of programmed all those caves into language. And Stephen Bishop was mapping those caves to try and win his freedom from enslavement, because he was a slave at that time in Kentucky. And he successfully did so. So he mapped the caves without any instrumentation, by sheer memory and will. And won his freedom from, by digging into the subterranean network, which is a very bizarre and fascinating history of where text adventures emerge from, right? Like kind of retracing the steps of this person quite literally trying to win his freedom from enslavement by mapping the subterranean geology of a landscape. So, looking at these individual histories and what societal manifestations they portend can be remarkably instructive.
Yeah, while you're saying, I was also thinking it wouldn't be too much exaggeration if we called game to be a world of spirituality also, because I think if we look at duality, like and the ultimate sort of struggle is to get out of that duality, then in duality you have to take sides, right? And then then automatically game emerges. So if you want to trace back, maybe that's the starting point, that when you have taken a side, which I have a follow-up question also. Okay, and then is there a broad category or genres of game that especially you deal with, and then any formative way to look at these? One, you said interactive fiction, right? And then any other genres that emerge very dominantly, which are easy to understand also.
Got it. So games are often classified in a variety of ways, and depending on how you choose to study them in what context, you get different classifications. So you might have, say, for example, analog and digital games, right? So games that are played outside of electronic simulations and within them. So this is games being split by medium. Similarly, you might have games which are classified by athleticism, games as sport and games as games. So making that distinction, or games by length, or games by sorted by narrative, or even games sorted by person, the sort of verb. So is it narrated in the third person? Is it narrated in the second person, in the first person? What has really happened in the absence of a history or a taxonomy, which is codified, is people use qualifiers to talk about games. So interactive fiction more often than not becomes a qualifier rather than a category itself. So often you will hear terms like it's a third person interactive fiction point and click adventure game. And basically what it is trying to do is each qualifier is trying to map the game closest to a game that exists before. All right. So if there is a game that you play in third person, and this the game that you have built, or you also play in third person, you call it a third person adventure game of some kind. If it's the game that you interact with by pointing and clicking on the screen, you call it a point and click adventure game. If it's a game that has role play elements in it, then you call it a role playing fantasy game, or a CRPG game, a computer role playing game. Again, so there are all these weird qualifiers that keep getting added, and it seems to create this very obtuse language around games. So you have like MMOs and massively online multiplayer games, which is qualifying a game based on the number of people who are playing it, but also how the game world itself is sustained. Whereas at the same time, you might have another qualification that would be something like first-person shooter games. So that tells you where the camera is located in the game. You're looking at the game world quite literally in the first person, and they do not seem inherently compatible, but over a period of time, they have all accreted together to help define, what these sorts of games mean or where they are located. Of course, I'm really only talking about video games here. This broadly applies to board games as well. So you have Euro-style board games, which tells you roughly what tradition they come from and what kind of mechanics you might expect, what kind of game length you might expect from it, and so on.
Yeah, it seems like it's endless, right? I mean, it's a very big ocean of because anything can be a play that way.
Yeah. So while you can play with anything, it does. The moment you start codifying something into games, you'll weirdly enough find that somebody has done this before, and there's a pretty good way of defining it or describing it, which might, on occasion, require very specific, invocations of nouns and languages, which seem esoteric. But the fact that there is a legacy to so much of interaction in the game is quite fascinating. It gives you something to build upon in very clear terms.
Does it? Is it safe to say that? Oh, wow, it's an interesting question. Is it safe to say that a game always has a creator? In a sense, very very metaphorically, that you cannot have anarchy. You know what I mean, right? Like,
That's a very good question. I think. So if I were to reframe it and tell me if the question still makes sense, can you inadvertently play a game that nobody has created? And I think it is possible, at least hypothetically, right? I think more than the role of a creator, a game demands complicity on the part of the player. For games are a weird medium, right? So for a book, you would think the author is central to the creation of a book. I think a player is central to the existence of a game. You might build a game if nobody plays it, and the game is designed only to be played. It ceases to exist. So I suspect that there might be conditions, where people play games that get organically created in negotiations between them, and by the mere complicity of the players, they become authors of the game sort of themselves.
No, in the world of blockchain, I think it's very likely, right? I mean, people will create few silos and
with the speculative bubbles, with market economies, with very large data transactions, there are these game-like metro-sized behaviors that people participate in, but nobody writes the rules for. The rules get organically written or written like a cellular automaton. Everybody sort of defining their own individual rules, yielding something quite unpredictable at an enormous scale, I imagine.
But is it necessary that every game should have a rule? Or rules define a game, or is that the other way around?
I do take the orthodox view here in claiming that yes, there are these rules that undergird a game, even if you cannot quite suss out the rules immediately, even if you cannot quite figure out what the rules of the game are. Like for example, the rules of a dinner party. You don't quite know what the margins of acceptable behavior are. They're not defined in stone, but you know that you're playing within a acceptable range, and that anything beyond that is going to be a faux pas of some kind. you
Hmm.
know so uh, even if the rules are not hard coded, I think rules create the margin, that separate games from reality,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
also give you permission to do frivolous things that games, at least within the sort of space of the game, seem completely sensible.
Got it. Yeah. I remember one very old TED talk by Harsha Bhogle where he said that in India, cricket is kind of the most agile ruled game, right? I mean, these were not his words, but like within Shivaji Park, one ground, there could be 20 matches happening. Sometimes the pitches are crossing each other, but there were like within that smaller community, there's a shared agreement that okay, this is the four, and these are like touch is 2D and what are like two declared and one declared. So it's quite fascinating that how we as collective agree on certain rules and then play, right? And then we
Exactly.
call it a game.
Exactly. And how
Yeah.
flexible we are with the definition of that game, right? So if you ask anybody who's playing with dramatically different rules on intersecting pitches, they are all playing the same game. They're all playing
Hmm.
cricket. Nobody
Yeah.
will say I'm playing cricket version 8.0, something like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. It's fascinating. Cool. And then, like, how do these, at least with Oleomingus, how do you like start off a game, right? Like, does it start with a narrative? Does it start with an event? Uh, Especially with your kind of work, is it just speculation of the future and then you build? Like, how does it come to be, right?
So most of our work is deeply interested in this very specific and very esoteric intersections. It's the intersection between interactive fiction and post-colonial narrative, post-colonial literature. So we are deeply, deeply interested in the function of authority and the recording of history. Right. So most of our stories begin from fractures in history caused by the action of power, how power shapes lives, identities, borders, belonging, anxiety, race, gender, and so on. And what stories emerge from the erasure of being able to articulate these ideas in sort of manifest material ways, especially in the world around us, so in the space around me, because most of our stories are set in South Gujarat, in South Malwa, in the region that I live and work within. So typically, most of my stories start in the past, and they remain there, firmly rooted in the past, as an excuse to talk about a variety of contemporary. Political, societal circumstances, and narratives, and people, and histories of landscapes and places that we are deeply interested in.
Hmm. Hmm. I remember even Avni Sethi, right? Like I interviewed her, and her conflictorium also deals with like the past and certain artifacts, which gives a different story. But then, like, can you? It's tough to explain the process, but like, where does it start, right? Like, you
Yeah.
find out a point in time in history, and then like investigate it further, or it's
Uh,
just a trigger point.
Got it. So there are. So I'll give you an example, and this might help
Yeah.
sort of clarify it further. So there's a game of ours called Folds of a Separation. It's a very simple game. It's a game of two characters. One, a solid, tiny little person on the screen. The other, a ghost who follows this person around, trying to move from the left side of the screen to the right one through a series of impossible labyrinths that fold over themselves. This being a video game, you can break the Euclidean grid. The labyrinths are a stand in for the bureaucracy that emerges from having to negotiate carceral violence, from having to negotiate the act of imprisonment. And the game's story is narrated as a letter written by somebody outside prison to somebody within prison, as a way to ponder the violence that stems from their mutual separation, the grief, the violence, the longing, that stems from their mutual separation. And it becomes an excuse, this very personal letter becomes an excuse to ponder what does it take for a state to gain the authority to put people into prison or withdraw them from public landscape and public imagination and incarcerate them, right? What gives a state the right to do so? What allows the public at large to think that a state is justified in doing this, especially to do it without trial? And what are the historic harms that such an authority being used quite willy-nilly have sort of seeded into our mutual histories, especially in the region that I come from. So for a game like that, a lot of the pondering begins either with an incident in the present or an incident in the past, and then we start to extrapolate beyond it a little bit, often including elements of bizarre, nonsensical literary motifs to soften some of the ideas that we are trying to negotiate, and also to make those ideas a little bit more playful and palatable for us to be able to negotiate with them within the confines of a game. And then we allow the logic of the game and the construction of the piece to guide us in how we frame the argument that we are trying to make, right? How we are trying to call attention to the very specific, very personal, very bodily harm that the actions of a state in this particular case seem to be doing. Another example might be a different game of ours called The Indifferent Wonder of an Edible Place, where you play as a municipal building eater. So you apply for the position of a building eater at the start of the game, and then you are asked to consume the last tower in your hometown, because your hometown has been slated to be removed from history entirely. And it became a very silly, to begin with at least, and then eventually poignant, excuse to think about what it means to belong to a place, especially a place of entangled history that is willfully being erased, right, from memory, from record, from popular imagination. And here you're quite literally consuming it.
Got it. I think it's very, very nerdy for me. But do you want to kind of drive a particular point consciously, or is it like, does it have to be more of play and then like recognizing over a period of time, and or more of introspection after playing?
So two things here, right? So if you think about rules in a game, what you are allowed to do and what your actions signify, they are very good metaphorical placeholders for rules in society. Games are often snapshots of the cultures that they come from. So games can therefore hold wonderful mirrors to what you are allowed to imagine as possible within society and what you are not. And the justification for doing so. So challenging those boundaries a little bit, pushing against them a little bit. We try and do that within the games. And of course, calling attention to the needs of, to the hurt, to the erasure of very specific kinds of stories, histories, or populace within the game tends to be a very crucial idea for us to try and grapple with. What is it that very few stories are talking about, and very few stories are able to communicate? One might, through linear narrative, through newspaper reporting, through conventional storytelling, talk about the procedural harm or the societal harm of incarceration. But how do you talk about the personal grief that emerges, right? And the lasting legacy of that grief as you negotiate a life without somebody that you have come to rely on because that person is in prison, or the other way around for that matter. How do I simulate a life of loss when I do not personally know what it means to be in prison, but can come to a compassionate understanding of imprisonment through the medium of a game in this case?
I have like a couple of more questions around that, but just to follow up on this one. So do you kind of, is it like, what's a good practice, right? And this is more of a tactical one. Like, what's a good practice that understanding the premise and just figuring out the game as you go along, or taking it easy and then making people acquainted with what the objective is in a step-by-step format, at least with your games, because there's a lot more going under the current, right? Like there's a lot
Yeah.
of subtext to it. So have you observed any patterns of evolution?
So with our games, we tend to be very skeptical of conventional gameplay. In
Hmm.
fact, in most video games, like the back of the box quotes are, you can do this and this and this and this and this in the game, right? You can fly
Hmm.
and launch missiles and also do this and also do this and build a building and whatever. We try to go the other way around. We try to limit what players can do dramatically, and then see what is the one thing that they are allowed to do and what does it actually signify. So we are not very interested in empowering players through game narratives. In fact, I personally believe that is a dramatically toxic thing, sort of trap that games have landed into, the idea that they will constantly cater to sort of male power fantasies. So we try and go the other way around, demonstrating how insignificant more often than not the players are to the incidents of the game, right? They often end up becoming ghosts in the game, loitering around in its corners like bystanders, once in a while negotiating its complex systems to no real dramatic effect, and finding minute satisfactions in being able to hold on to their ground within the game that they began with, coming to some sort of a graceful conclusion about their relatively muted role within the game world, which is not to deride or discredit the role of interactivity. We are just very careful with it. We believe movement in a game world, to being able to look around, to being able to eat, or shoot occasionally for that matter, are very careful actions that signify very consequential changes, whether in a simulated world or outside, and have to be dealt with very with a great degree of care and almost reverence, if you're
Hmm.
trying to negotiate
Is
complex histories in particular.
correct. It seems to be a very uphill task, right? Because there's one side of empowering everyone. In fact, places like Afterlife and stuff, you want to be like born again and again and like have your own world, where you are almost a creator, while here you are more of making adjustments and responding to the larger narrative. So
Exactly. I mean,
so
games.
what, how do
Oh,
you
sorry.
kind of create those incentives then,
Yeah.
like just
So
to be in the game, right?
yeah. So, I mean, one advantage we have is we make very short games, and I've never quite understood the fascination with necessarily having to make enormous games all the time, that you can sink hours and hours and hours into. Sometimes it makes sense, and sometimes it simply does not. Especially if what you are perpetuating, is a power fantasy catered to cisgendered white male, action figure like demographics, and you're looking at the world down the barrel of a gun, constantly for 200, 300 hours at end. I believe that is problematic, to say the least, right? To cater so exclusively to that fantasy. I believe there is room for those kinds of games and those kinds of negotiations, and there are certain narratives that can exist uh, within sort of violent battlefields. But to look at every inch of the world across the barrel of a gun is just patently bizarre, and that and to construct an entire industry that supports, encourages, and eventually justifies, the creation of only these kinds of narratives over and over and over again, and often quite violently vilifies anybody who tries to resist them, is very sad. So you're right. It is difficult to try and push back against it, but therefore all the more necessary, because fewer and fewer people are going to be doing it. We need to be, at the very least, be able to figure out what all can we tell using games, right? What all kinds of stories can we tell using games? And unless somebody is working on, and quite a few people are, thankfully, working on very difficult narratives using games, you will never quite understand just how beautiful the medium can be, just how revelatory, just how therapeutic for some people, just how intricate and demanding and bizarre an experience with games might be, which might eventually refactor the way we look at reality itself.
Hmm. Hmm. But somewhere games are meant or designed for escaping, right? So isn't it kind of fine? Like, no?
Uh, so I would say escape is a tricky term. So games are designed to be dissimilar to reality or separated from reality in specific ways. I do not believe games are designed to let you ignore reality or game worlds to exist at the cost of reality. And that is what increasingly we define by escapism. That I deserve my game regardless of what it costs in the real world to be able to, be a part of that simulation. Or I deserve my game regardless of how denigrated its representation of other races, other people, other clans, other countries is. And that is a kind of privilege that I simply do not recognize games have ever allowed, or our societies, for that matter, have should ever allow. That is just a bizarre demand to make of a of the medium. To say that games are escapism of some kind should not automatically portend that they are also a moral exit chute, right? Which
Hmm.
then allows us to do anything at all as long as it is within the confines of a game without recognizing what real world harms they might be causing, down the chain. Of course, games are definitely permissive simulation spaces, so you should definitely be able to play around with ideas that would be very complicated and difficult in reality to play around with. And there is an irreverence built into games, a playfulness built into games that you are expected to take advantage of. But that does not mean you ignore reality altogether
Hmm.
to try and arrive at whatever you think is playful about whatever
Yeah,
you put
yeah.
into games.
Correct. Yeah, I completely agree there, and it's kind of, yeah. I'll actually follow up on that one. So games have like certainly kind of evolved and come a long way, right? Like now, I believe it's kind of the biggest industry on this planet, like after Hollywood also. So and I'm not a big game person. In fact, I have like my claim to fame as like completing the paid version of Angry Birds. That's it. So, but yeah, the games I recently have been exposed to through my designer friends and stuff like that is like there's werewolf, there's mafia. In fact, there's something like I think some series on some OTT as well based on this game, which was like simulated in a real environment. And somehow whatever I noticed is that they're playing on a very fundamental thing called trust,
Yeah.
right? So what's going on here? Like how is it kind of impacting society, impacting psychology, impacting uh, like have you observed or you have been part of these conversations? So can you share something about it?
Yeah, definitely. So what has increasingly happened and has happened at a remarkably fast pace over the last, I would say, 20-25 odd years, is because of the interventions of some very specific phenomena. We have ended up metricizing large parts of our world that were not measurable prior to now, right? Whether it be how well a government is doing based on Twitter polls, whether it be likes and tweets to metricize our social relationships, whether it be fitness counters or and so on. We've sort of turned portions of our specific realities into points, and they feed into broader instrumentalized systems of existence that determine where capital is allowed to flow, right? So these point systems have become increasingly important for certain groups of people to survive, and for other groups of people to be able to survive because their livelihoods have suddenly gotten disrupted by like you sort of arbitrary rules on Amazon's listing page, for example, right? Or the number of bot reviews that you might be able to accrue for a product that you list on site, and how it has a sort of cascading effect on mom and pop shops, in sort of grocery chains and so on. So within this sort of a space, we are all engaged in these intricate games that nobody has written rules for, and where the rules are either black boxed or keep changing based on arbitrary impulses of capital, and political circumstance or societal circumstance or consumer pressure or what have you. And that automatically creates a deficit of trust, right? You have no incentive whatsoever to trust these metrical systems that you are so now completely dependent on. So you have other metrical systems supervise them, and suddenly we all find ourselves living in this panopticon where we are constantly measuring parts of reality, and anything that cannot be measured is no longer considered inherently valuable, because you cannot trade on it, you cannot speculate on it, and you cannot sort of barter it around. What you're seeing with the invocation of a lot of these games that are built around trust, some of them very old, like Werewolf, are a kind of re-simulation, almost an enthusiastic look at the end times, as it were, a re-simulation of what it means to have or not have trust, and how quickly societies reorganize themselves into cutthroat, competitive sort of counters, to arrive at either points of equilibrium or points of extreme tension and competition, to be able to resolve these situations. We have started in our simulations to play with ideas that give us genuine anxiety that we are not able to articulate in the real world, because we have inadvertently stepped into games, and or we have pulled elements from games and put them in places where they clearly do not belong.
Yeah. So is it kind of very scary or just scary?
I would say it is very scary because games continue to remain a medium that is not extensively studied. So even within the limits of a game world, we have very little idea for why players do what they do under certain circumstances, and this changes dramatically from game to game. Now, without that understanding, and without games as a medium by themselves being capable of resisting puerile societal impulses that might find their way into games, if you extrapolate game systems into the world at large, and you take some of the most cutthroat systems like points, right, and you put them into the world in the form of like counters or something, or retreats or whatever, you start to get aggressive, illegal, competitive behavior that starts to reshape society in very specific ways that you had not anticipated, and that you have no clear control over, because the game is not designed to control how players play it exactly, especially if you only take a bit of the game and then you extrapolate it to so many players at once.
Yeah, it seems actually it's very scary. Yeah, no, but uh, uh, so who kind of like why do these things become very addictive? Like I'm going one level deeper as well.
Yeah.
That what makes these because we as society have created these sort of narratives of God and bunch of other moral and social constructs to kind of evolve into something better than animals or than primitive species, right? So um are we like taking them back to that primitive behavior, and that's why it's more addictive? Like what's happening with this addiction overall? Like I've seen at least who are gamers are like fully into gaming, right? Like they I'm not sure even they have some social life sometimes, right? So
Yeah, addiction
yeah.
is a wonderful point of entry into games. So behavioralists would typically qualify these kinds of interactions with games as Skinner boxes, operant conditioning chambers, and so it's a fairly simple system if you think about it. So if you are, so this is based on a series of behavioral experiments with rats, but if you are given arbitrary rewards for actions, your actions become increasingly desperate and continuous. So a rat when put inside a chamber is given a mild electric shock or a treat based on whether the rat presses a button or not. But there is no logic to when the treat is delivered or when the electric shock is delivered. And a little while later, the rat just keeps on pressing the button, obsessively waiting for the treat, hoping for the treat. And that is sort of what is happening with a gambling engine, right? So a gambling machine will spit out its rewards in an arbitrary fashion, and you cannot figure out the pattern behind why it is spitting out those rewards in that particular instance. So you keep gambling. That is what makes it so deeply addictive, the arbitrariness of a reward system.
Hmm.
If you were to be able to game the rewards out, if there was a rule set that you could resolve, then resolving the rule set is very, very satisfying in games. That is why puzzle games are so satisfying. And once you hit the end of a puzzle, that's it, you have hit the end, right? You
Done.
don't have any need to continue playing. So to keep players hooked, the puzzles are not puzzle like at all. They are simply arbitrary. They're just random. And they are a random combination of punishments and rewards, which are sort of meted out to you over a period of time. A lot of authors have had a lot of fun with this, writing stories about people being sort of motivated by a degree of punishment, a degree of fear, a degree of enticement, the carrot and the stick, as it were, but completely arbitrary, to create this addictive loop of behaviors which you find very hard to exit from. And I would say, I mean, certain games have loot boxes built into them. In countries, this practice is now becoming, in specific countries, becoming illegal to market even video games with loot boxes built into them to sort of younger populations. But there are very many games that have some gambling adjacent system built into it simply to keep you playing, especially games where there are fewer reasons to keep playing because the game is so good, right? Because the narrative within the game sort of absorbs you, because the society within the game is so fruitful that you want to spend time there. You replace it with a loot box, with a gambling engine built into it, like a casino system, effectively, to keep you hooked on the game. And this is true not just for games, this is true for social media sites as well. This is true for anything that borrows a game like system, a reward point system on shopping sites, whatever, right? Anything that is quote unquote gamified uses this trap to lock players into a simulation that has you keep engaging with the interface, with the method over and over and over and over again, for arbitrary amounts of reward, partly to keep your eyeballs stuck to it, keep you clicking on something, but also partly so that you remain closeted within the conditions that the game has created for you, and you believe your reality to be indexed by the manifestations of the game.
Hmm. 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 In social media, or at least certain places where it's now very evident, right? Like it's out there in public that these algorithms are designed in a way to create these kind of echo chambers or loopholes and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
In game design, you said that it's more of arbitrary, but is it consciously designed in such a way, or it's left to the algorithm to like create those simulations of rewards?
No, so it's consciously designed that way. It's quite fascinating. So I'll give you an example of loot boxes, right? Loot boxes are very good at convincing you that abstract virtual objects are inherently valuable. And so take, for example, a skin, right? Just a character's clothes within a game, or the skin for a gun for a character within a game. Now, you are told that certain skins are very, very valuable, and that you have a percentage chance of getting that skin based on drops. And these drops, sometimes quite literally from the sky, these sort of crates, they drop, they open up, and then you rarely find a rare skin inside. But you're always told what a rare skin is and how valuable it is to possess one in the game. There are even marketplaces built inside games where you can trade these skins, sometimes for real world money. And the volume of trade will sort of will blow your mind. It's enormous. These are full-fledged marketplaces that have to be regulated against inflation, that have to be regulated against, that are against sort of fake and sort of forged skins and so on. But the idea that you are constantly told what is valuable within the space of the game, and then you're constantly denied access to whatever is valuable, while you're told somebody else has access to it now. Somebody on the other side of the map just got access to that drop, so why don't you continue playing for a while? Maybe you might get access to it as well. It's a very deliberate, mischievous kind of behavior that is designed to keep you playing.
Wow. It's further dark, yeah.
There is definitely an underbelly to games and game cultures that is, as you say, very, very dark, very, very toxic. And I think it is in many, many ways a mirror of the spaces that games come from, who gets to build them, who plays them, and so on.
Correct, correct. So, what would be, I mean, now that if this, obviously, this now in the gaming world or that ecosystem of people, it will be kind of emerging and becoming obvious as they evolve. But for regular people, I think who are not in the gaming world, but it's very easy and slippery slope to get into like something and then like deeper, getting deeper into the engagement. So, uh, the things which you mentioned about this dress also, like, or it's very, very volatile in nature, so that you have to like get it faster. Who's supposed to design this, right? Like, who does this job of, is it like a typically an engineer or a designer or an architect, or the author? Like, who owns this responsibility, right?
So it's usually, unfortunately, a game designer, who'll sit down, build these systems, perfect them. There'll be programmers involved. There'll be, because more often than not, these games are being played at enormous scale and require an enormous infrastructure to be able to support them. You have to be doing this calculus in the background, right? This calculation of who gets what skin, what is valued, where, when, and so on. It's more often than not a team of people, very skilled people, very good at what they're doing, often trying to build something which in pockets is genuinely beautiful and at the same time can inadvertently be harmful as well. uh, all of it sort of coming together, and we don't have a very clear idea of what game systems are likely to become toxic in what pocket, or what portion of game culture is likely to be co-opted by people who espouse affinity towards racism of a particular kind, and so on. Like, we have no idea what is going to get appropriated next. uh, so what might seem like a completely innocuous system and genuinely fun to play today, when you hit 1,000 player threshold or a 10,000 player threshold, might become toxic at that point. So it's often a delicate dance of going back and forth between processes of moderation. So a lot of large game companies find themselves in the same unenviable position as social media sites do, having to moderate conversations in chat, having to moderate trade of artifacts within their games, having to moderate sort of what players are allowed to build and broadcast and live stream. Because without that, these communities do tend towards a certain kind of toxicity, or they get overwhelmed by a small group of actors who are particularly vocal but also particularly toxic.
It seems like a very important responsibility, right? Because sometimes it could be just the game clicked into from 1,000 to a 10,000 threshold just because of that reward system, which can become later on very toxic. So it's almost like, how long does like a typical game, like, I mean, I also interview automobile engineers, like designers and stuff like that. So when they're actually on the road, certain trucks can take like 1 to 2 years of designing. Certain, like, most of the time movies also take 2 to 3 years, right? Like intense movies.
Yeah.
So in game, like, what's the, like, in your case you design short, so, but by and large, like, these kind of games.
So commercial games can take very long to design. There are games that have been in production for 5 years, 7 years, 10-year periods as well, big ones, with hundreds, sometimes thousands of people working on them. Multi-million dollar productions that are meant to run for hours on end. So players can spend hundreds of hours in these game worlds, and they're incredibly detailed, procedurally generated, with a lot of voice acting involved, a lot of cinematics involved, a lot of engineering involved, new tech, new engine tech, and so on. There are games that are built on existing engines that can be churned out pretty quickly as well, but it still takes much longer than most other mediums to build, partly because they are collaborative. You need very many people with very different skill sets to be collaborating to be able to build a game, and partly because they are not device agnostic, so you have to keep pace with what people are going to be playing them on and try and match their devices, and match a variety of devices in the case of, say, something like mobile games, uh, to allow people to actually play them. So it can vary from under a year to several years.
Okay, okay. And how much does like typically the games that are produced by Oleomingus take
So we
time?
work on much shorter timelines. We work with art residencies and grants and institutions to study games and research them. So we work on 3 month, 6 month, 8 month timelines, because we are looking at one idea. We're looking at a game that you can play in under 20 minutes typically. We are
Hmm.
more often than not looking at installations rather than games. So they're running on one kind of device. So we're not really bothered about making it sort of cross-platform and compatible across multiple devices. And we are also not selling our work, right? So we're not really worried about advertising and marketplace and any of that at
Correct.
all.
Got it. Hmm. I think the more I don't know, it's a factor of age, it's a factor of uh, gathering more insights. But the more I see, I think it's not about what is seen, but the seer itself, right? Like, what are you looking at? How are you looking at things? So, uh, when a game is designed, I think now, like, since this series is about Designers Digest, I
Mhm.
wanted to like talk more about what goes into that. But seems like the narrative is much more broader here. So, what could be the biggest responsibility of a designer then, like in if they are entering into the world of game, as in game design?
So we are at a point in time when games are clearly at an implosion of sorts. You're seeing it scale up. You're seeing the medium find a degree of cultural coherence and acceptance. You've seen game cultures bleed out into other cultures, like movie cultures tend to bleed out into other cultures and so on. And you're seeing cross pollination between mediums. So games becoming other forms of narrative, and then games back again, and so on. So they are clearly becoming a cultural force capable of narrating meaningful tales, and therefore, for a game designer, I think it is incredibly important that we keep the medium inclusive, right? That we start decolonizing what is deeply toxic within the medium already, and we allow room within the medium for new practitioners to flourish and feel safe within, which is very hard to do inside games right now. So women working within the games industries, transgender stories being told within the medium of games, are finding it very hard to break through the barrier of, again, sort of cis white male narratives that have colonized the medium for a very, very long time. Stories from other parts of the world which are not anglophone, stories from other parts of the world which are not Eurocentric, or which are not centered around North America, uh, are woefully missing in video games or in board games or in other sort of popular forms of games that seem to disseminate very quickly outside of pockets in sort of South Korea and in Japan, which also have their own peculiar imperial structures within which they seem to craft their games. So finding room for that variety of vernacular, local, varied voices to exist within games, and creating both sort of marketplaces, societal spaces, and game cultures that are welcoming of these newcomers should be the baseline responsibility of anybody working in games today.
Hmm. Hmm. I would also ask the second line of responsibility for the very fact that with Squid Games, I think there was as in like from whatever my exposure, which is very little, there have been at least a change in perspective as to something external, like a different world exists now. I don't think Squid Games is a good one. I mean, like the series is great, but now that the American version came in and it had a very not so uh, extremely polarizing punishment, which made me just drop off in the first episodes itself, right? So like,
So
what would be the second responsibility of how radical this, or the one point which you mentioned, right? Like an
yeah.
arbitrary incentive designing.
Squid Games. I'm not familiar with the Americanized version that you mentioned, but I am familiar with the original the
Korean,
original
yeah. Mm.
Korean show, I believe. Which is so it's a game within a specific medium, right? So it's the imagination of the speculation of the extent to which people are willing to go to, win a pot of gold, or whatever, what
Mm.
have you. And the games by themselves are pretty simple. What makes them dramatic are the stakes of the games. The fact that you
Mm.
might lose your life, I believe, in most of those games within it. Now, that's another media's imagination of what games or what societies have become to some degree, right? To
Mm.
what cutthroat societies have become. I would argue it's not so much the role of a game designer there to be crafting games and narratives around such cutthroat conditions. It'd be very rare that somebody's asked to design a game where somebody's literally going to die.
Mm. Mm.
Right? There might be deaths caused by games through some kinds of very complex chain of after effects, over a period of time, and through societal complexities. But the game designer is rarely in a position to design games as absolute as the ones represented in popular media, like Squid Games. So I think, luckily, sort of designers can rest easy in that they're
Mm.
never working with such concrete absolutes, uh, but to be conscious of what it is that you're producing and its capacity to have unintended consequences,
Mm.
or rather to resist the easy charms of plucking simple addictive game systems and game loops from popular media and popular literature and popular imaginings, and turn them into actual games, that keep people addicted but do not seem to do anything beyond that. Might be a good caution, for game designers to
Mm.
keep in mind. I do not want to be prescriptive here, because there are very good games, very interesting ones, built on seemingly addictive systems, which are able to critique those systems within the framework of the
Mm.
games themselves. But it does require a degree of sensitivity and nuance and understanding in what it is that you're trying to do. If you just, copy paste a series of games just because they happen to be popular and just because they invoke a violence that is pleasurable, without questioning the font of that pleasure and what it is that you are sort of invoking societally when you have millions of players playing these kinds of games, then I think you're doing a disservice to the medium.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Could you before we conclude, just can you give me any example of like the game which is, like, say, designed by Oleomingus, who which has kind of brought in a very kind of confidence from the user, like to you, from its players, saying that like we never knew about this narrative, which is kind of yeah,
So,
like in the post-colonial world, like this was there and I never recognized this, and now because of this democratic kind of a setup I was able to explore it. Like, if you can give any example with the game.
So there are quite a few of our games that have dealt with actions of contemporary power and actions of historic power that are new to players who engage with them, who do not recognize that the mere drawing of territorial boundaries was this violent, or that the mere establishment for a home, of a home for a group of people, was this contested. And because we work with esoteric histories from a relatively small geographical region, quite a few of the stories that we tend to narrate are more often than not surprising to the people who play them, especially if those people happen not to be Indian or not to be local or not to be fluent in the vernacular that the stories are emerging from. We also play with the obfuscation of authorship. So there are quite a few fictitious authors embedded in the histories that we tell. And we quite
Hmm.
enjoy how very often our fictitious authors are confused as being very much real. And
Hmm.
then people go hunting around for their stories and are sorely disappointed to not find any,
Hmm.
because the author that we have adapted the works from tend to be fictitious. Sometimes these revelations occur in the form of game mechanics themselves. So we have there's a game we built quite a while ago called A Museum of Dubious Splendors, and it's a very simple conceit. It's a game about the poisonous nature of museumification of objects and the tendency to orientalize artifacts by decontextualizing them inside a museum. So you have a plethora of ordinary objects, staples, slippers, scissors, Colgate tubes, littered around in a museum at gigantic scale. And you're told a fable-like story before you see the object. Then you open the door, then you see a very ordinary object, that was portended in the fable. And what players realized and started doing, it's something that we had not really anticipated, was they would wait at the door before entering. They would wait outside the door, listen to the story, and try and guess what the object is going to be inside. And the entire act of publicly playing this game, because it was an installation, became trying to figure out what the object is inside the game. A guessing game that wasn't embedded in the original video game at all, but became a very interesting communal act to participate in, and a very simple metaphorical marker of how easy it is to create an object inside a museum and then forget about its contextual relevance to actual histories and the lives of the people who used it once. So it became a very simple sort of translation of what would otherwise seem like a fairly complex or nuanced idea.
Hmm.
And it's very exciting when that happens. It does not always happen with all our games. We try. This is something that we don't quite have a handle on. I don't think anybody does.
Hmm.
But yeah, these are the systems and ideas and narratives that you slowly try and negotiate.
Cool. I think I'll conclude with one last question, which was like zooming out completely. Where do you think we are heading as game players and game makers also? And if you have like been dabbling with like what's in the metaverse or what's AI going to change? There are like now movies which are kind of like interactive right now. So
Yeah.
like, what are your observations about the future?
So if you look at a really small snapshot of the video game industry over the last year, right? Just as in looking at the immediate past and the immediate future to try and get a sense of what is happening, you'll see enormous games coming out. And at the same time, you'll see an unprecedented number of job cuts, a huge number of people being laid off, people who thought they had comfortable, productive, beautiful sort of jobs doing beautiful work within the industry being laid off, often without warning, entire studio shutting down. And this is happening across the board, across regardless of the scale of the project that you're working on. um, and this points to a very worrying trend. You have at a time when you need the industry to start focusing on labor, the labor used to produce games, the labor used to produce the technologies that people use to work with games and play games and so on, and the labor of people in the world at large that creates the stories that games are trying to tell. You have a movement away from labor. You have game industries trying to pivot away into AI art, which cannibalizes existing art. You have the game industry trying to pivot away into the metaverse, which is recycling extremely redundant game design from existing games and just putting it into screens that are slapped really close to your retina.
Hmm.
uh, so I mean, this is a point where I think we're going to start to see a lot of game studios unionize. You're going to start to see a lot of organization around the people who are building games as a form of resistance against an endlessly shifting goalpost of what games ought to be, or what is considered a meaningful experience in games. I mean, the idea of chasing better graphics, more immersion, more realism at the cost of everything else, and constantly churning out a series of shooting games or banal meeting rooms in VR or something is just dull, right? It's just boring at the end of it, end of the day. So I think we're going to start to see this factional resistance between two ideas of what the future of games is going to look like. It's either going to be plural and led by those who build games, or it is going to be decided in corporate boardrooms and is going to be driven by teleological expectations of technological change.
Yeah. On both fronts, I think it's going to be a little dark anyway.
It is going to be tricky to negotiate, definitely, but there is, there's
Yeah.
some degree of hope in a worker-led movement.
Yeah. But yeah, if you look at the larger arc, anyways, it's like now on the downside. But yeah, I don't want to end on a negative note. But all the power to you for creating these games and counter narratives, and obviously democratizing these stories of understanding of stories. Actually, cool.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's it's a fascinating field to be a part of, and our practice is still very, very nascent. So I'm very curious to see where we end up, over the years.
Yeah. Cool. We'll conclude on this note. Thanks, Dhruv, for giving your time. It was wonderful chatting with you, and this episode definitely needs like a hearing and making a lot of notes for me to understand a lot more nuances of it. But yeah, thanks for giving your time. And that's it from today's Gyan session. For show notes and more Gyan, visit audiogyan.com. And if you wish to connect with me, I am at Audiogyan Moments on Instagram. Until then, take care.